Those of you who saw the Jurassic Park movie may remember that the very first character who gets eaten by a dinosaur is a lawyer, which is an interesting bit of social commentary, because most of us in the space community, many of us, come from a physics or engineering, or science or engineering background, and so we don't tend to spend much time thinking about legal issues. But the reality is that the space environment, you see this picture showing Sumbandila in a pristine space environment, but the reality is that the space environment today has over 20,000 man-made objects in orbit around the Earth. And these are the ones that we can see because they're larger than 10 centimeters. There are millions of other smaller fragments that we cannot track from the ground. And so we need rules if we are to avoid chaos in outer space, and of course avoid possibilities of collisions and so on, because even things like moving the orbits of satellites can have an effect on Earth observations in terms of calibrations and so on. So the outline of my presentation today is to tell you a bit about the international regulation of space activities, the state of regulation in South Africa, say a few words about the South African Council for Space Affairs, which is the national regulatory body for space activities, and then to focus on the emerging regulatory framework for space-based, for space activities, and of course it will have relevance for Earth observation. So to start with some remarks about space law, and just to acknowledge that the space environment is completely different to any terrestrial environment. You cannot take maritime law or aviation law and just extend that into the space domain. It requires a special legal regime. And as I said in my opening remarks, space law is required to ensure the safe, sustainable, and orderly use of outer space. So there is also a growing diversity and number of space users. Whereas in the early days of the space age, we just had the two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, having operational space systems. And we now have over 40 countries with space agencies and a far larger number of countries operating satellites in space. You can see there on the slide the size of the space economy, if you like, as of 2011, almost $290 billion. It's a lot of money that's invested out there, and of course lots of potential for accidents, and where there's a potential for accidents, liability issues will arise, and that's why we need lawyers in outer space and space law. Now, the international governance of space activities for non-military space activities, is the competence of a standing committee of the United Nations called the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, or COPUOS. It comprises currently 71 member states, including South Africa, and there are two subcommittees, a scientific and technical subcommittee and a legal subcommittee, that consider questions of a legal nature pertaining to the uses of outer space. Now, I don't have time here to go into all the activities of COPUOS, but just to say that in the context of this presentation, the COPUOS has produced over the years 5 treaties, which I'll describe in a moment, and also 5 sets of legal principles governing space activities. And my colleague on the Space Council, Advocate Sekula, whose presentation will follow mine, will go a little bit into more depth on these issues. These are the current treaties that govern space activities. The ones that are shown inside the blue box are the ones that have been ratified by South Africa, and I'll just very quickly go through them. So the first one is the Treaty on the Principles Governing the Activities of States in Outer Space, the so-called Outer Space Treaty, and this, if you like, is the Magna Carta of space law. The other treaties are basically elaborations of concepts that are included in the Outer Space Treaty. These treaties, once they are ratified by states, are then domesticated into their national legal systems through a variety of ways, and in South Africa we have domesticated it through the Space Affairs Act, which I will come to in a moment. Now, the Outer Space Treaty has a number of interesting principles, but one of the articles, Article 6, states that it is states that bear the international responsibility for activities in outer space. So, in other words, if a private company in South Africa launches a satellite into space, it is the Republic of South Africa that bears international liability, not the entity that launched it. This is an important point to appreciate. And another point that is included in the treaty is that states are required to maintain authorization and ongoing supervision. And you'll see that these concepts are embodied in our Space Affairs Act. So, some of the key principles of space law are the non-appropriation of outer space. In other words, no country, no state can appropriate a set of orbits, orbital slots for their use in perpetuity. Slots can be assigned for a period, for example, in the geostationary orbit by the International Telecommunications Union, but no country can appropriate outer space or the celestial bodies. The treaties talk about peaceful uses, in other words, peaceful being non-aggressive. The military, of course, makes extensive use of space, but peaceful is understood to mean non-aggressive. There is a principle of non-interference, meaning that if you put up a space system, it should not interfere with the space systems of other countries and other users. So this means no interference in the electromagnetic sense, but also it could mean non-interference in the sense of a high collision probability, for example. It talks about benefits for all countries, meaning that the legislation envisages that the exploration and use of outer space is the province of all humankind and not of only a few spacefaring nations. And space is regarded as what in legal terms is called a res communis. In other words, an environment that belongs to everyone, and therefore users have to take into account the effect of their actions on other users of the space environment. Now, in South Africa, the legal framework for space is embodied in the Space Affairs Act of 1993, and the other acts shown on the slide there, the Non-Proliferation of Weapons of Mass Destruction Act, the ICASA Act, and the most recent addition to that, the National Space Agency Act. Now, there are, of course, other bits of legislation that I haven't included in here, which I will refer to in a subsequent slide. But I'm looking here primarily at the regulatory side of things in terms of activities in outer space. So these are the acts that would have the primary relevance.